So on to Chapter 27, Measuring Domestic Output and National Income. So to start with, we'll be looking, again, when we talk about domestic output, the comparison to the two, we're looking at the production side, the output, and the income side that we're looking at in terms of our circular flow, right? So two different sides of the same coin, the production and the income. At any rate, GDP is gross domestic product, and that's we measure that in real terms or in nominal terms. Real is when we're adjusting for inflation. So if we have inflation or deflation, but if we have inflation, we would be reducing the GDP from the nominal GDP, the face value GDP, market value GDP, down to that inflation adjusted number, taking the inflation out, reducing it, if you will. So we start with GDP, again, gross domestic product. We go from GDP to GNP, which is gross national product. And from there we take out pretty basically depreciation. It's also called the consumption of fixed capital, consumption of fixed capital, which is depreciation, which gets us down to the national income. And we'll talk more about that as we go along, but I'll just kind of briefly go over it. So GDP, again, that's production within the country, regardless, the domestic country, regardless of the home of that producer. So, for example, Toyota producing vehicles in Indiana or in Kentucky or wherever, that would count toward U.S. GDP, as would the production of Ford vehicles domestically in the U.S. GNP, gross national product, what happens is that we repay, it's called repatriation of earnings. And so what happens is that the Toyota, that's the production, the value of the vehicles that are produced here, the final sale price, right? The GDP, if you will, is returned to Japan, the home country for Toyota. So it would be reducing, would take the Toyota out of the number, if you will, in the U.S. and likewise, so the Ford production domestically would remain, but also what would happen is that the Ford production, for example, overseas, like Ford of Europe, would be brought back to the U.S. So it adds into the GNP. The U.S. is fairly typical. We're pretty close to the same. What that means is that those receipts that are flowing, back and forth, they tend to cancel one another out. But anyways, we'll talk more about that as we go along. The next piece that we're doing is the depreciation. And the depreciation, there are some other net national product things that come along in here as well, but we'll just stick with this concept. Depreciation is, from your accounting classes, if you've had accounting, that's when you use up a capital item. So a capital good means, remember when we talked about durable versus non-durable? Durable goods, so far as the firm is concerned, are called capital items. Capital items are those things that typically last more than one accounting cycle, like more than 1 year. So if it lasts less than 1 year for the firm, that's typically an expense item. If it lasts more than 1 year, that would become a capital item, and you pay for it in 1 year, but you use it up over a period of whatever, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., numbers of years going forward. So you kind of use portions of that asset, if you will. And that's what we call depreciation. We'll be talking about that. So these are numbers that going from GDP to GNP, from GNP to national income, the difference basically being, again, depreciation, reduces that number down to that national income. National income is important, of course, because we go back to our circular flow. National income is the income that we receive for the use of our productive resources, for our labor, entrepreneurship, capital, and land. So that would be the wages, interest, profits, rent, etc. They'll be flowing back to the productive resources or the owners of those productive resources, if you will. Okay, onward. So the federal debt in October 2021, found this interesting, was at $28.4 trillion, and by February 2022 it had climbed to $30 trillion. Oh my goodness. Anyways, that's more to be dealt with later in the class. So when we're talking about GDP is equal to personal consumption expenditures. So remember our circular flow, that portion going from the firm back to the household, those goods and services, that's the PCE, personal consumption expenditures. The GPDI, GCE, and GI, and NEGS, that has to do with the non-consumption expenditures. So it's anything that's not being consumed by the household falls into that category. So GPDI would be the firm, and the firm in this case would be purchasing such things specifically as those capital items that were mentioned before. So that would be machinery and equipment, robots, building new buildings, so on and so forth. That would be GPDI, gross private domestic investment. GCE and GI, that's government consumption expenditures, which would those again are short last or not very long lasting items that are used up within an accounting cycle. Again, just roughly speaking, 1 year versus gross investment. Gross investment are those capital goods, those capital items that are purchased or produced by the government. So an aircraft carrier would be included in gross investment, hopefully. And NEGS is net exports of goods and services, net exports of goods and services. And what we do is we take our exports and we subtract the imports. And of course, the net is the exports minus the imports. And of course, our NEGS, or net exports of goods and services, is actually a negative number. We'll get to speak to that a little bit later, and that's because imports exceed exports. So back to when we talk about inflation, when we talk about real, we have $1 today, and 1 year later with 10% inflation, it reduces the value of that dollar by 10% or 10 cents down to 90 cents. Nominally speaking, however, that $1 we're holding out in front of us, 1 year later, even with that 10% inflation, the dollar still has that face value of what? $1, okay? Okay, so with GDP again, that's gross domestic product. We're looking at all the final value, if you will, the final market value of all the goods and services that are produced in an economy over a given period of time. Typically, it's updated on a quarterly basis, or it is updated on a quarterly basis. But what we focus, on is the annual data that comes out that we get for GDP growth, whether we're talking about in dollar terms or if we're talking about percentage of change, which is the more typical way of looking at this. How much the economy changed, how much economic growth did we actually experience from one period to the next. Again, keeping in the proper context there with the real GDP or the inflation-adjusted GDP and the nominal GDP, which is the face value. It's the market value GDP, meaning again the expression that we used in before, but with if you have $1 in front of you today. And that dollar, you hold the dollar in front of you, in 1 year's time, you take that dollar out, and if there's inflation of 10%, what's happened is that even though the face value of the dollar is still the same as $1, the actual value or the real value of that dollar has been reduced by 10%, so that's now worth 90 cents. Nominal, and I've already alluded to this, but let's step back. So you've got $1 in front of you today, and it says $1 on the dollar bill, and you put that dollar bill away. In 1 year's time, you take the dollar bill back out, and what is the value of that bill? It's $1 still. That's the nominal value, the face value, the market value, if you will, of the bill that we're looking at. So that's when we're talking about real versus nominal. And GDP, again, gross domestic product, we're looking at it from the spending, in terms of spending or expenditures and production side, and the income. So these are two sides of the same coin. Different side, again, of the same coin. So in the spending or expenditures production side, if you will, the it's equal to rather the PCE, the personal consumption expenditures. So that's consumption by the household, plus the non-consumption expenditure side. So the spending by those other than the household, if you will. The GPDI would be the firm spending on what? On goods that are for the firm, on capital goods, on capital items, on robots and machinery and equipment and buildings, et cetera, that that are going to last for a period of time. So that's the capital side. If we go back to our production possibility curve or frontier, that would be the capital expenditures versus the consumer goods, capital goods versus consumer goods. Capital goods would be this non-consumption spending. The consumer goods, of course, would be that PC or the personal consumption expenditures. So again, GPDI is, those are the expenditures at the firm, capital goods. And the next would be government spending, and that's the GCE and GI. So that's all lumped together, meaning the GCE, where with the GPDI, that does not take into account the expenditures at the firm that are expense items, things that are used up rather quickly, like gasoline in your automobile, et cetera. So again, for the GCE and GI, we're looking at government expenditures. GCE is government consumption expenditures, plus GI, which is gross investment. GCE would be that short-term expenditures, things that don't last very long. Things like, if you're using pens at the office and you're working for the government, the pens would be considered that GCE item versus GI, which is gross investment, and that would be such things as aircraft carriers. So this is quite the these are quite different things that we're talking about. The GI, again, are longer lasting items. They're capital goods in essence by the government, for the government. The last is NEGS or NEGS, NEGS, which stands for the net export of goods and services. So what that means is it takes exports, subtracts out the imports. So exports, of course, are those goods that are produced in the domestic economy, but the goods themselves actually leave the country, right? They go out of the country. Versus imports. Imports are goods that are brought into the country, and at any rate, this is straightforward. The difference between the two, of course, is that the imports are not produced in the domestic economy, so that means that the income that's associated with that does not stay in the domestic economy. So it's in some ways it's a double hit, or it is a double hit in terms of the dollars, if you will, leaving the country, and also the goods and services that are purchased are not produced in that home or domestic country. Okay, and drilling down on this a little bit further, when we're talking about expenditures, production, spending, and there are a lot of different ways of looking at this. PCE constitutes the largest portion, so this would have probably been a few years ago, but it's pretty close to being accurate, probably about the same. So of those expenditures, of that GDP, PCE comprises the largest portion at 68, 70, sometimes higher percentages than that even. GPDI is gross private domestic investment, and again, that's the firm is producing capital goods for the firm to be used at the firm to do what? To produce more PCE, more personal consumption expenditure items, more goods and services for the household as consumer. The different types of goods that the household has are, of course, non-durable and durable goods. Just as with all of these, there are durable and non-durable types of goods that we're kind of referring to. So again, the GPDI would be those capital items, those durable goods that are being produced at the firm for the firm. The GCE and GI, that constitutes about 18%, a large chunk of the economy, if you will, that's being it's being consumed. The expenditures, the production occurs again at within the framework of government. The GCE would be on the expenditure side, on the expense side, and the GI would be on the capital side, or those longer term assets that would be purchased. Like again, aircraft carriers, pen versus an aircraft carrier. GCE would be a pen, GI would be that aircraft carrier, 18%. And then we get to the NEGS, or the NEGs, net exports of goods and services. Those are exports minus imports, and you'll see a negative number there, a negative 3%. And what that means is, of course, that imports exceeded exports. And so you do end up with a negative number. So, of course, that tells you why it is that imports are withdrawal. That kind of further illustrates why that is the case. In this case, we've got exports greater, if you will, than imports. Imports greater than exports. So we end up with a negative number. It drives us to our 100% so far as looking at the one side of that two-sided coin. We're looking at spending, expenditures, production. The flip side of that, of course, would be income. Income would be what's going from the firm back to the household, in terms of owners of those productive resources. So the income would be the wages going to labor, small business, the profits, the rent. That's actually it probably shouldn't have even had that in there, but anyways, the small business, that would be the profits flowing through to small business, rent flowing through to the owners of that land, and profits, of course, and then the interest. So profits would be flowing through to the equity owners of the firm, for example. So if you're a stockholder, if you're a shareholder of whatever that firm is that's out there, you would be getting some of the profit that would be associated with it. Who else would be getting the profit? Could be labor in terms of profit sharing, and it would certainly include the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur in terms of their stock options, where if the company gains in value over a period of time, you're able to buy it at the old price, and you're able to make a profit off the sale of the price, which leads to the other side of this when we're talking about when we're looking at equities, when we're looking at how the equity owners of the firm are compensated. One would be that profit that we're talking about in terms of dividends, et cetera. The other would be in terms of capital gains. Capital gains are they're unrealized until you actually sell that piece of stock. Presumably what we're saying then is that piece of stock has gone up in value, and therefore you would end up with some profit that would be associated with that. The other side of this we're looking at are the debt owners of the company, of the firm, and that's where the interest payments come into play. That would be the bondholders, who would be getting a certain percentage based on whatever the agreed upon price was as stated on that bond itself, right? And lastly, when we're talking about, we're looking at transfer payments, and transfer payments would constitute, they're not strictly speaking income. Transfer payments are payments from the government flowing back through to the household. So what constitutes this income, if you will, loosely? Wages are, again, the largest portion. So we're talking about the household as the owners of those productive resources, right? As opposed to household as the consumer, where we were talking before about that personal consumption expenditures. Small business, those would be the profits flowing through to small businesses. The rent, again, it doesn't just stay at the small business, it goes back to the owner of that small business. Rent, of course, goes to the firm in terms of, we'll say, like an ExxonMobil, getting the whatever price per gallon of gasoline, per barrel of oil, etc., and then it's dispersed to whom? To the household as owners of that firm. Profits, again, we've already talked about that, but profits would be flowing through to either it could be in terms of profit sharing for the labor, it could be in terms of profit, in terms of dividends for the owners, the stockholders, and the retained earnings, if you will, and this kind of folds back into the company, driving up the share price of that stock. You could also say that the shareholders, they could earn two types of profit. One would be from dividends, second would be from capital gains. So if the if the price of the stock rises, then that would also represent that profit, and if you were to cash out, if you were to sell that asset. Interest, of course, is paid to the debt owners of the company in terms of bonds, et cetera, and transfer payments are coming from government. So that kind of rounds it out so far as the GDP in terms of expenditures and income, looking at both sides of this same coin, right? Okay, so here we are once again revisiting our circular flow, which we talk about repeatedly in this class, obviously, in all economics courses, especially with the at this level, when we're talking about micro and macro with the introductory courses, there's a great deal of emphasis on the circular flow. But anyhow, when we were talking before about the income and the expenditures, two sides of the same coin. The expenditures, of course, would include the personal consumption expenditures flowing from the firm to the household, and the flowing from the firm to the household, that was the PCE, which constituted close to 70%, right? And then the non-consumption expenditures staying on the top right up above. So the non-consumption expenditures would be those expenditures that are not done by the household. So starting with, again, investment, that GPDI side, the gross private domestic investment. This would be the firm purchasing what? Purchasing machinery and equipment for the firm, capital goods, right? GC and GI, government consumption expenditures and gross investment. Again, government consumption expenditures would include, the items that are expense items would be typically considered, from a business perspective, things that are very, very short-lived. Like that pen that I had mentioned, Ford versus GI, that gross investment would be for longer lasting assets. Specifically, we're looking at such things as like an aircraft carrier. That's kind of the extreme, of course, but you get the idea. Something that's going to last a long time. And then exports are also part of this. Exports are, again, they're produced at the firm, and as a result of which we're adding to the overall production, if you will, and the income that flows from the exports flow back to the household in the form of wages and profit sharing, et cetera. And also in terms of profit flowing through to the owners of that company. Conversely, the imports are those goods that are coming in, but the money is going out. And also the production does not occur within the context of this circular flow. So as a result of which we have to net out exports. We don't have to, but we'll just say we're netting out exports versus imports, and that would be that NEGS, the net exports of goods and services. And since imports exceed our exports, that would reduce the GDP, if you will. So the flip side of that coin, if you will, has to deal with the income. That's the income distribution on the bottom. And you'll notice it's flowing from the firm, but it also would include payments that would be coming through government as well, of course, and also those goods that are being produced at the firm, like export goods that are leaving the country, but the income remains in the country. Anyhow. The idea is that that income that's associated with that production at the firm, government, et cetera, the things that we've already described here. So the income that's associated with that would be the wages flowing through to the household. The household, so for the labor rather, flowing through for the labor owned by the household, which is, again, not just wages, could also be what? Profit sharing. So that could also include profit sharing flowing back to the household in the form of its labor. So the next piece that we're looking at would be the interest. Interest, of course, is paid for the use of debt capital. There's other types as well, but the idea is that debt capital, interest would be paid debt capital. Debt capital would be bonds. Bonds are merely loans that are going to be issued by some firm, could also be government, of course, but we're saying we'll stick with the firm. And what that would be then, the bond that would be flowing from the firm might be a $10,000 bond from General Motors and the very specific, the interest that's being paid, the other terms of the repayment of that loan, if you will. So that would be the interest that we're looking at in terms of the income distribution. And also we're looking at profit. So profit is back to what we were saying before. Who gets profit? Could go to labor. Could also go to the entrepreneur, of course, in the form of those stock options that we had mentioned before. And it could also flow through to the household in the form of the owners of the firm. The owners of the firm, we've already talked about being the debt capital holders, but there's also the equity capital side of this. And the equity capital side speaks to this profit. So the profit could come in two different types in terms of ownership of the firm by the household. One would be in the form of dividends. That's profit sharing flowing from the firm back to the household as owners of that firm, or owners of the firm, if you will. And also it could be in the form of capital gains, meaning if the firm grows and the share per share value of that stock increases over time, let's say it doubles in 5 years and it goes from $50 to $100 per share. So what could happen is that the capital gain is the difference between what the stock price was that was purchased versus what it's sold at. So that would be the strike price at which that stock would be sold at by the owners of the firm. So you're selling, you're liquidating your position, you're getting rid of the stock, you're selling off a portion of your ownership of the company or whatnot, and that would be the other form of that profit. And lastly, we're looking at rent, and rent would be flowing through back to the household, the owners of the land. The land, of course, includes what? All the natural minerals and so on and so forth. And we'll say, wait a minute, ExxonMobil owns the oil wells and so on and so forth. But who in fact owns ExxonMobil? Those are the shareholders, those are the stockholders. Okay. Anyway. Okay, so at its root, the NIPA, or the National Income Product Accounts, coming from the BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, this is an accounting system that's set up for the country in terms of that GDP that we're talking about, that economic growth. Trying to measure all of these things. And at any rate, so if we start with GDP being at the top, GDP is gross domestic product, all production in the domestic country, in this case we're talking about the U.S., regardless of the home company of the firm. For example, Toyota producing vehicles in the U.S. and Kentucky and I believe in Indiana as well. But I know there's a truck plant, I think, in Kentucky, and there are a number around the country. And it would also include the Ford production, the domestic manufacturing production in the U.S. itself. So that's the GDP, all those goods and services that are produced in that country. The GNP is the gross national product. And the idea is that we're trying to send those monies, if you will, those receipts, back to the rest of the world, and from the rest of the world back to the U.S. So the term is called repatriating income. So we're repatriating, sending the dollars back, or the income back to that home country. So Toyota, all that, the Toyota receipts, all that, their portion of that GDP goes back to Japan, and likewise, or conversely, I should say, Ford of Europe, for example, would come back to the U.S. And meanwhile, of course, the Ford domestic production remains in that GNP number as well. So you're bringing all that Ford production back home, and you're sending all of that Toyota production back to Japan, so far as dollars and cents income is concerned, I guess you'd say. So that next step, we're going from, I have GDP to national income, but it's actually GDP. That's the next step would be GNP. And then there's also net national product, gross domestic. There are a lot of different things in between. But the idea is that we're moving from GDP to GNP. And in doing so, looking in the year 2020, for example, the GDP was at $20.9 trillion. So the income receipts, rest of the world were $1 trillion, and meaning income receipts from the rest of the world were $1 trillion, and the payments, the income payments to the rest of the world, so Toyota going back to Japan, amounted to $0.8 trillion. So the difference between the two, of course, would be that the income receipts minus or less the income payments, and we ended up with a net gain of $0.2 trillion or $200 billion, just chump change, right? Big, it's actually quite large. As a result of which the GNP is actually larger than the GDP, going from $20.9 trillion GDP to $21.1 trillion GNP. So before I go on, we're moving on to the next piece, but I want to point this out, and that is that for the U.S., there's not much of a difference between GDP and GNP. Whereas with other countries around the world, there might be a significant difference in terms of GDP versus GNP. So, and I'm guessing at this, but we'll just say, we'll use Japan as an example. Japan, the cost of production within, domestically has gone up significantly. And I'm guessing here, and it's probably the similar situation for Germany. Think about all the production that's being done outside of Germany or Japan, and that repatriation, bringing those dollars back in from the rest of the world, you could certainly see a situation where the GNP, for example, might be significantly higher, for a country like Germany or Japan than it would be for the U.S. The U.S. has got a little bit of a difference, in moving higher to GNP, but I'm guessing Japan and Germany would be a lot more because of the production. Think of Japan production of Toyota products in the U.S., for example, or for that matter, Germany. In terms of Mercedes, they have Mercedes production here. They have Volkswagen production. They also have, I think, BMW, and they may actually have Audi production here in the U.S. as well. I'm not quite sure about that. Toyota, similarly, of course, has Toyota, Nissan, and Honda producing significant amounts in the U.S. So this could cause that GNP number, that repatriation of earnings, to be significantly higher in countries such as that. All right, and so the next piece that we're looking at is we're moving from that GNP down to national income. And there are a few different stops along the way, but essentially what we're talking about, the big difference between the two, would be moving from GNP, or GDP for that matter, in the U.S., since there's not a significant difference between GDP and GNP, to national income is the consumption of fixed capital. That is depreciation. And for those of you that have had an accounting class, depreciation is an expense, meaning it's something that when you're using up, remember we talked about capital goods flowing through to the firm, in terms of GPDI, gross private domestic investment, GI, gross investment, for government, et cetera. For that matter, durable goods too, but we're not counting durable goods to the household in this depreciation metric, if you will. But anyhow, the consumption of fixed capital, depreciation, it reduces, it takes that GNP and you take out $3.6 trillion worth of that. Of those capital goods that are kind of used up over a period of time. We'll get into greater detail as we go forward as we talk about this, but that moves us from that GNP number down to that national income, reduces it from $21.1 trillion down to $17.7 trillion. So that's a significant drop off. And the reason that we talk about, there's more to this as we kind of go forward, but one of the things to consider is this. Making this very, very personal. For each of us, we like to see the economy grow more rapidly. And the reason we'd like to see the economy grow more rapidly beyond the typical, oh yeah, that's a good thing. Why is it a good thing? It's a good thing on a very personal level because what that means is that the more the economy grows, the more the economy expands, the greater will be the national income. And why is national income actually more important, if you will, than that GDP or GNP or any of the numbers that precede it? Going down to that. And that is because that national income, who gets the national income? Income flows through to the household as owners of those productive resources. So for your wages, for your interest, for your profit, for your rent, this is that national income. This is what constitutes that national income. And so making it very, very personal, think about it in terms of wages. Chances are if your national income goes up, your wages are going to go up. And it's more important, that's why this national income is probably actually a better measure than the GDP is so far as we're concerned on a very personal level, right? Okay, so now we want to take a look at, drill down on this depreciation or this consumption of fixed capital. And it's welcome to the world of economics, these bizarre terms, consumption of fixed capital. It's not that bizarre, but you have to think about it a little bit. Depreciation is really straightforward. Depreciation, something's used up over a period of time, right? Consumption of fixed capital is another way of looking at it. It's using up that capital good, if you will, that's the capital that was purchased by the firm, using it up over a period of time, right? So that's that consumption of fixed capital. So this is our walkthrough on that. It's pretty straightforward, but you kind of have to go over this a few times to kind of get your head wrapped around it. So there's a $50,000, that's pretty cheap, I guess now. $50,000 truck is sold for a van or something that is sold to a business. That $50,000 is counted in current GDP. So that's that GPDI. It's a gross private domestic investment. It's added to that GDP for year one. In year two, the firm sells 100,000 goods of, this is a small business, obviously, right? Sells $100,000 of final goods, and that's also added to year two GDP. Embedded in that $100,000 is $10,000 of depreciation on the truck, that van purchased the previous year. Capital good depreciated, used up. In this case, we're saying it's got a 5-year lifespan, if you will. Over 5 years on the depreciation schedule. That's, this is just, when we talk about depreciation schedules, yes, I know we're walking into accounting, but not too far. The idea is that we'll say the truck, that van is going to last a certain period of time. And so in this case, we're doing straight line depreciation over 5 years for that vehicle. All right. So walking through this one more time, this depreciation or consumption of fixed capital example, a $50,000 van, truck, whatever, is sold to a business. That $50,000 is counted in the current GDP, the current year, year one. The firm in the second year sells $100,000 of final goods. We'll say that it's associated with that one vehicle. It doesn't matter. $100,000 of final goods in total for the firm, and that's added to that year two GDP. So we're adding; those are the goods, the final goods, right? That is our definition for GDP. The sale price, if you will, of all those final goods that are produced in the country for a given period of time. In this case, we're talking about 1 year. So embedded in that $100,000 is those final goods. There are $10,000 of depreciation on the truck purchased the previous year. Capital goods, again, are depreciated over a period of time. In this case, we're looking at being used up over 5 years, based on our depreciation schedule, straight line depreciation. So really what we're saying is that in a very real sense, we're overstating our GDP. There's some double counting going on, isn't there? We're adding back, so we already recognized the $50,000 for the van in the first year, but in this case, we're also doing what? We're adding this depreciation to that as well, that $10,000. So we're overstating that GDP by that amount. That's why when I say that national income, it's probably more important, not just on a personal level, but like from an accounting perspective. That national income is probably actually more accurate depiction of what the economy, how much the economy actually grew in the previous year. That's all. Anyway, it's just the idea is that trying to understand what this kind of a nebulous idea, I shouldn't say it's not nebulous, it's pretty straightforward. This idea of depreciation, how it is presented in the NIPA or the National Income and Product Accounts by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, right? Anyway, the next piece I'm just going to really quickly introduce, I'll just read this off, and this has to deal with this concept called aggregate demand. And aggregate demand is just as the name implies. It's aggregate, meaning overall, the overall demand. So we're looking at the overall economy. And the depiction of it, if we look on the right side here, we'll see this is a typical downward sloping demand curve, right? So aggregate demand sloping downward to the right. But what you'll notice is that the difference, if you will, so far as the axes, the y-axis, the vertical axis, price level, straightforward, and on the bottom, or the x-axis, the horizontal axis, that's the real output. So we're looking at price levels as based on that output on the bottom. So price on the y-axis and output on the x-axis. So just kind of keep this in mind as we're going through. So that aggregate demand is sloping downward to the right. Behaves the same way, law of demand, so on and so forth, right? So PCE plus injections at non-consumption expenditures at GPDI. So think about it in terms of kind of like GDP. However, when we think demand, we want to think about this more in terms of demand versus that quantity demanded. And what I mean by that, and this is, again, we'll be talking more about this going forward, so just wanted to introduce this to you, this aggregate demand idea. GDP is equal to that specific value, that quantity demanded, with the AD, or the aggregate demand, that demand, we're looking at the entire demand, or we're looking at the entire demand curve, if you will. So again, for GDP, we're looking at the quantity demanded, its very specific value. With aggregate demand, we're looking at the entire demand curve, or the entire demand curve, shifting that demand curve, etc. Prices go up, or prices go down rather, real output increases. Again, that relationship. Okay, so that's as far as I want to go with this right now. We'll be getting into that when we get into the aggregate demand chapter ahead. Okay, so let's get real. When we're talking about this economic output, so on and so forth, GDP, all that stuff sounds good, national income, that sounds good, but how does this actually get to us, down to the individual, if you will? And focusing on this concept of personal saving now. So that's kind of what it's left over, the residual. Remember, where does our income go? Income goes to taxes, it goes to consumption, those goods and services that we buy, and the residual, what's left over, is our saving. So that's that personal saving concept. So starting from the top, GDP, this was from 2020, $20.9 trillion, less that depreciation. Remember that consumption of fixed capital, that truck being used up over a period of 5 years. So we want to back that out to get to our national income. Remember, we're driving this down to our individual level, so to speak. So it reduces that GDP by $3.6 trillion. And anyways, it reduces down to $17.7 trillion. The math isn't right because we're skipping a couple of steps in the process, going from GDP directly through, kind of down through national income, taking out the biggest chunk, that depreciation. So we're skipping GNP, we're skipping net national product, gross domestic output. Anyhow, we're moving down to national income. So from national income at $17.7 trillion, we're reducing that by corporate profits of $2.2 trillion. So we're taking this part out, if you will. Taxes on production. Taxes on production would be those things that are taxes that are not associated with like payroll taxes. This would be taxes on sales taxes, excise taxes, all the different types of taxes that when we buy things, if you will. 0.8 trillion contributions to Social Security and Medicare, $1.5 trillion. So we're reducing income by these amounts rather. Interest paid on national debt, 0.6 trillion. So this is something that we'll be talking about later on, but it's a big chunk, isn't it? That 0.6 trillion, $600 billion per year. And then we're adding back in personal transfer payments and transfer receipts. So personal transfer payments would be $2.9 trillion that would be flowing through to the household in the form of like Social Security benefits, Medicare benefits, Medicaid benefits, any kind of welfare type benefits, and the transfer receipts amount to, again, that $4.2 trillion, which would being included in that, in the above portion as well. So this equals personal income. All these things flow back into this personal income idea. And from that, we're taking out our taxes. So remember, we're starting with our PI, our personal income, and we're reducing that by our taxes. So the personal taxes would be $2.2 trillion, and that leaves us with what's called the DPI, or the disposable personal income, of $17.4 trillion. So remember, when you hear disposable personal income, that's after taxes. So income itself is before taxes of personal income. Take out those taxes, and we end up with our disposable personal income, DPI, 17.4 trillion, less personal outlays. Those would be consumption expenditures in essence, right? Other things as well, bills, etc. The point being that that accounts for a large chunk, and that would be $14.5 trillion. And what we have left over is our saving, our personal saving. According to the NIPA, it was at $2.9 trillion. And in this case, we're saying the personal savings as a percentage of that disposable personal income is at 16.6%. This is extremely, extremely high. So what happened in the year 2020, for example? Typically, it's in, again, 7%, or actually much lower than that typically. And which also leads to another thing, is that why don't Americans save very much? But it's kind of hard to make that argument when we're seeing saving of $16.6 trillion of our disposable personal income, meaning our income after taxes. So we ended up saving 16.6%, and that had to do with a lot of the payments back to those transfer receipts. A lot of those payments that were coming through for during COVID, those I forget the term, the stimulus payments. Excuse me, the stimulus payments that came through, and people did not spend all that, partly because there was nothing to buy. I shouldn't say that's kind of an extreme, but there were fewer things to buy. And also partly because people were very, very concerned. They're very, very nervous about going out there and spending all those dollars that were flowing in. So typically it's in a much, much lower range, like 7%. But here's the thing. When we think about saving, about this saving, and Americans have been notoriously poor savers, at least so far as the rest of the world is concerned. We think that way as well. But think about it this way. There's some savings, there's some forced saving going on that kind of changes this, the view of this, if you will, and that would be such things as Social Security, Medicare. We kick into Social Security, Medicare, and that is going to do what? That's going to provide us with some form of pension, if you will, going forward. So that's actually a saving, because we are going to be receiving some benefit. And I know we could talk about that later in the class, about how much that benefit we're actually going to realize going forward, especially you guys. But nonetheless, that should be part of saving as well, shouldn't it? Anyhow, that's just a small but important point, if you will. So further on savings, this whole topic of savings, or saving. Remember, in economics, for some reason, there's no S on the end of savings, saving rather. But I'm sure there's a reason for it, but I don't know what it is. So when we're talking about the different metrics, measurements of saving, one that we've been talking about is that NIPA, the National Income Product Accounts. The other one has to do with the Fed, as in the Federal Reserve. And there it's through their flow of funds accounts. So in general, the flow of funds from the Fed is typically higher due to the fact that many household items are treated as capital assets and are depreciated, thus lowering, anyways, I don't have an end to that, but it treated as capital assets and are depreciated, which actually increases our savings rate. Anyways, I've got thus lowering. I had a random thought there and I didn't finish it, but the idea is this: is that when we're talking about consumption of fixed capital, for example, or the depreciation as measured by the NIPA, what do they cover with that? They cover the expenditures from firms buying trucks. They also pick up government expenditures like the aircraft carrier that we kind of talked about. That's also picked up, but they do not pick up household expenditures except for, homes, and we won't get into that. But that's new homes. That's as an aside, if you will. But the idea is that you don't pick up other items that would probably be considered capital goods. So what I've got on here is education expenses. Should they be considered a capital item? Are they depreciable? Or at least in theory, are they depreciable? So what I mean by that is here, I'll put forth this. So when we talk about capital, how many different types of capital do we have? We have physical capital, we have financial capital, but we also have what? We also have human capital, don't we? Human capital is what? Anything that we can do to improve our labor, in essence, to improve ourselves as providers of the productive resource labor. Anything that we can do to improve that is considered human capital. Whether we can train ourselves to throw a fastball 100 miles an hour, with a tremendous amount of control, or if we can get a PhD in economics. Did I say economics? Anyway, so these are all building upon your human capital. So in order to get there, you have to do what? The education expenses. Education is very, very, very costly, extremely high opportunity cost because of two things. Well, two things we'll talk about. One, of course, has to do with the money that's coming out of your pocket. Secondly, it's what you're foregoing in that process. So not just the money coming out of your pocket, but also you're foregoing the opportunity to do what? To be out there working and earning an income. So you're getting a double hit, if you will. You have to pay for this. Plus, on top of that, you are not getting paid for work that you could be doing otherwise. Opportunity cost, right? Your next best competitive option. So here's my point: is that the Fed, that when they look at household capital items, they're talking about such things as buying new TVs and buying different new computers, new appliances, new cars, so on and so forth. Those are depreciable assets that they depreciate, but they do not pick up that labor component, that human capital side, which I would guess. Think about it. Are you going to be using your education for the rest of your life? We'll just say yes, absolutely. How about that? That's our answer. So if that's the case, that would definitely be all about what? Developing your human capital. That's the reason why you're in school, quite frankly. One, of course, is to learn, to gain knowledge, etc., but also to put that knowledge to work in terms of what? Securing you a higher position, increasing your opportunity cost, meaning increasing, how much you're actually worth to a prospective employer. Anyway, you get the idea. So this is that education expense. This is my argument that should also be considered a depreciable asset, something that you should be able to address on your taxes, but it's not. I don't suggest you do that. Don't ever say I said to do that. But this is something that is definitely open for discussion. So GDP, there are a couple of different ways of kind of measuring GDP. One thing is that finished goods versus value added. Intermediate goods, VAT, it's all about taxes. So in the U.S., we make the final value of the car, for example. We take the final value of that vehicle. Whereas in Europe, they take all the component parts separately for tax purposes. More taxes is really what it comes down to. That value-added tax. If you go to Canada, Canada also has a value-added tax in place. But at any rate, the other point is that when we talk about intermediate goods, those are goods along the way. Say you're putting together a sandwich, and the various components going into that sandwich. We'll just say turkey and cheese and mustard, mayonnaise, whatever the heck you want to put on there. So the intermediate goods are those things that kind of go into that, if you will, or the things that build up to those final finished goods, if you will. Okay. Anyway, so just to kind of walk through in 2020, kind of rehashing, transfer payments amounted to $2.9 trillion. Those are payments coming from the government. Total spending amounted to $6.9 trillion. This was, I think this is at the federal level, but I'm not quite sure. At any rate, the point is that government spending in this case, whether it's federal or total government spending at local, state, and federal level, amounted to $6.9 trillion, which is a huge amount. Total receipts that were coming in were $3.7 trillion. Those are tax receipts, et cetera, that are flowing in from individuals and so on and so forth. And that means, of course, the difference between the two is that there's total borrowing of what? $3.2 trillion, which is huge. That's added to what? Our deficit. And there are different ways, again, of measuring a lot of these things. The NIPA, for example, looks at things on a calendar year from January through December, whereas when we talk about fiscal year for government purposes, we go from October 1 through the next year, which would be the fiscal year. So, for example, the 2022 fiscal year would be October 1, 2021 through September 30th, 2022. That would be the 2022 fiscal year, okay? Okay, so yes, let me clarify. That was the $3.7 trillion in receipts, if you will. That would be, we're talking about the federal level, at the federal level. So this is table 3.2, federal government current receipts and expenditures from the BEA, from their NIPA, National Income Product accounts, right? So the current receipts amounted to about $3.7 trillion. Of that, tax receipts amounted to about $2 trillion. Of that, the personal current taxes amounted to $1.7 trillion. And it walks through all the different contributions, and including such things again as the contributions for government social insurance, which would be Medicare and Social Security primarily. From the other thing, the other takeaway on this is that I want to point out was the receipts for the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, these are their payments, if you will, so far as taxes, of $90 billion, or there, $91 billion. Anyhow, it's just, it's a huge portion that they're kicking in. And we'll talk more about this as we go along, but I'll elaborate right now. So the Fed, when they don't necessarily pay taxes, but what they do is they contribute of their, the interest that they receive. They're not required to do this, but this is what they do, and that is they contribute most of those taxes. It flows back into government, and this is the Federal Reserve banks. This is the receipts that are flowing in from the Federal Reserve to the tune of $91.7 trillion. It accounts to about 95% of the interest that they get on the securities that they have in their possession. Typically government bonds, meaning U.S. Treasury securities, bills, notes, and bonds, and also mortgage-backed securities. So those are, this is the Federal Reserve kicking this back, if you will, to the government. Anyhow, so the rest that we're looking at or the next side that we're looking at, of course, would be current expenditures. Current expenditures were $6.8 trillion. And this is government spending, right? Federal government current receipts and expenditures, expending $6.8 trillion, which is an enormous amount. And the biggest chunk of that would be the current transfer payments. So that was that $4.4 or $4.3 trillion number. And that's the numbers that were flowing out primarily, again, Social Security, Medicare, recipients. Also on top of that would have been those stimulus payments that we're talking about in the year 2020. The other piece of this would be the interest that we're looking at. The interest payments amounted to $534 billion this year, payments for our debt, payments on the debt, as opposed to the previous year. That was the number I typically look at, about $600 billion. It's definitely going to be moving in that direction kind of going forward, but at any rate, that results in the net government saving, of course, being a negative $3.1 trillion, meaning, of course, that's the deficit. It's added to the deficit, right?